Our meditation words are drops of God from Tess Bumgardner. This picture that is on the screen is one that I took in March of 2024 at the Dry Creek Falls Trail on the Oregon side of the Columbia Gorge. It also sits on the Pacific Crest Trail. And although I'll never be one of those people that walks the Pacific Crest Trail, I can say I've been on it, a little tiny piece of it, which joined us. But anyway, we went to a wedding out there and it was a great little hike. So get comfortable in your seat. We're going to have some meditative words. I'm going to read the words, and then we'll have a few moments of silence together when I'm done. So get comfortable. Take a deep breath in. Let it out. Take another one. Let it out. God. God is water sleeping in high-piled clouds. She is gentle drink of rain, pooling lake, rounding pond, angry flooding river. She is frothy horth-maned geyser. She is glacier on mountains and polar ice cap, and breathtaking crystalline ideas of snowflakes. She is frost dance on trees, and we are drops of God. Her tears of joy or sorrow, ice crystals and raindrops in the ocean of her. God is air wallowing all about us. She is thin blue atmosphere, embracing our planet, gentle breeze. She is wind and fearsome gale, centrifugal force of tornado and hurricane, flurry of dust storm. She is breath, spirit, life. She is thought, intellect, vision and voice. And we are breaths of God, steady and soft, changeable and destructive. We are her laughter and her sighs, atomic movements in the firmament of her. God is fire burning day and night. She is sting of passion, blinking candle, heat that cooks our food. She is fury forest fire and flow of lava which destroys and creates and transforms. She is home fire and house fire. She is giving light of sun and solemn mirror face of moon and tiny hopes of stars. And we are little licking flames flickering in her heart in the conflagratory furnace of her. God is power of earth in and under us. She is steady, staying, fertile loam, body, matter, and tree. She is crumbling limestone and shifting sand, multicolored marble. She is rugged boulder and water-smoothed agate. She is gold and diamond, gemstone. She is tectonic plates and their motion, mountains rising over us, rumble snap of earthquake, tantrum of volcano. She is turning of our day, root of being, and we are pebbles and sand grains and tiny landmarks in the endless terrain of her. God is journal of time marching through eternity. She is waking of seasons, phases of moon, movements of stars. She is grandmother, mother, daughter. She is transcending spiral of ages, whose every turn encompasses the rest. History, a mere babe balanced on her hip. She is spinning of universes, an ancestress of infinites. She is memory. She is presence. She is dream. And we are brief instants, intersections, nanoseconds, flashing gold-hoped moments in the eons of her. God. God is. And we are. Gently return to us in this room, in this space. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to share a reading that Stephen gave me as preparation for his message. This is an excerpt from page 16 of the book Noah's Flood, the new scientific discoveries about the event that changed history. Elsewhere, the first warning of the coming disaster was also the whisper of a sound, a weak throbbing from far away. Several bands of farmers on the delta had settled in clusters of post and beam houses surrounded by field and corrals. They grew grain, raised cattle, fished in the nearby lake, and hunted game in the marsh. Confused by the strange sound, they stood on the bluff and stared in the direction from which it seemed to radiate. They could see nothing except a constant cloud that lit up the night sky. A group of distant kinsmen, haggard and terrified, came in along the shore. They described how their valley had been inundated. The waters of the great salt sea above were pouring into the lake below. The hollow where they had lived had become a wild flume. Their villages had been swept away by the torrent. Days later, the rising water encroached on the delta and invaded some of the fields nearest the lake through the network of irrigation ditches. The puddles swirled around their dwellings and soon imperiled the granaries. The far-off noise thundered louder and louder while the water mounted every day, bringing with it a wash of floating debris. The frightened villagers headed upriver into the hills. Apprehensive that they were being punished, they made sacrifices to their goddess, praying that this awful nightmare would soon pass. If the waters did not recede, the people pledged to retreat across the mountain divide in search of new land. I'm excited that a fellow UU can join us in our pulpit today. Let me tell you a few things about Stephen LeDoux. 4 years of Catholic seminary high school and 2 years of seminary college in the times they are a change in 1960s led Stephen to complete college and an MA degree in the natural science of behavior. Today that's called behaviorology. After teaching college in Australia for 3 or 4 years and China for a year, and because somewhat unbelievably, Ronald Reagan and James Bond signed his MA degree, he returned to studies and completed his PhD in 1982. He then taught at the State University of New York in Canton, where he met and married his spouse, Dr. Nellie Case, who's joining us today, and they got married in Canton's UU Church. To preserve each other's jobs, they stayed in Canton for over 30 years and raised 2 children there. Then in 2016, they retired to Los Alamos, New Mexico, from where they visit their children who both currently live in New England. And that's where they're coming back from today to join us in our pulpit. So please join me in welcoming Stephen while we do our technical changeover here. Welcome, Stephen. That's on your head first. Your head. There you go. And you can just lay it here or.
It's just fine.
Does that work?
That's fine.
Okay.
It is interesting also that we've been doing some work back at the church in Canton this year because they're celebrating their 200th anniversary, 1825. So most likely, we are all familiar with biblical stories, like Noah building a boat, a big boat, and stuffing it with every kind of living thing to escape the flood caused by a supposed global deluge. We are likely all raised on this story and likely inspired by it. We may even be better persons because of it and some of the lessons in it. Stories on many topics in most cultures are all humanity had for many millennia. Today, however, we also have science. Can science provide similar stories with similar effects, inspire us, make us better persons? My bias suggests a yes answer. Perhaps a closer look at the flood story as told by science discoveries will be revealing. Noah's story, of course, is not the only great flood story. Many ancient cultures supplied history with similar flood stories. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh. These stories all seem to have originated around the same time from cultures that share a large but limited geographic range, a few thousand miles across, centered on Anatolia, more recently known as Turkey. So, what happened? Did holy scribes in several cultures all get told by their local god at about the same time to write down a lesson-filled flood story? Or did something really happen? Something of such seriousness that it prompted continuous retelling, first just orally, and then possibly a millennium or more later in written forms. Historians know that oral traditions can last longer than this with compelling accuracy. The written versions usually contain some added layers of lessons. But what could have happened? What natural, though catastrophic events could predictably have had that kind of effect on people, prompting such continuous retelling in the terms of the times about a god or gods punishing the taboo activities of some people in those cultures by wiping out the world in a great deluge and flood? Now, maybe Noah's flood occurred just as his story tells it, or maybe it is but one mystical story among many with moral lessons. Yet in 1999, a Science magazine author's brief book review in a letter caught my eye. It discussed a book titled Noah's Flood, the new scientific discoveries about the event that changed history. In this book, the authors, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, reported their multidisciplinary research results as leaving little doubt that something really did happen, and that this science flood story helps many otherwise seemingly unrelated puzzle pieces fit together into a meaningful whole. For years, however, other ongoing life events, such as writing natural science and behavior books, kept me distracted from this fascinating topic. And there matters stood until a letter and response in the July-August 2023 issue of another periodical, Skeptical Inquirer, inspired renewed interest. The discussants in that issue seemed quite unaware of the discoveries reported in Ryan and Pittman's book. Why? Were there substantive, science-based concerns, objections, criticisms of their work? My subsequent search failed to turn up any that seemed decisively compelling. Your search may vary, but my search did turn up a lot of unhelpful, though predictable pushback from people compelled to prefer a literal Bible reading. So, what's all the fuss about? Our Western cultural traditions, among others, have appreciated several versions of the Great Flood story for millennia. And in the last couple of hundred years, the increasing appreciation of science and its improved methods for collecting hard data has also increased interest in what such data might tell us about stories like the Great Flood. Can data satisfy our curiosity? Can data answer our questions about what really happened, to whom, when, where, and why? Indeed, the mere possibility of some solid scientific answers about this well-known story is itself somewhat inspiring, although perhaps not in just the traditional ways. We here cannot cover everything that Ryan and Pittman and their hundreds of colleagues discover. For that, read the book. But we can cover a few of their main points, and through them, perhaps paint a picture of what science has begun to tell us about the Great Flood. What really happened, to whom, where, when, and why. Originally, relevant data began to accumulate from diverse times and places and people. It gradually piled up like loose puzzle pieces in a box. But only late in the process did anyone begin to see the connection of these puzzle pieces with the Great Flood story. By a dozen points, here are some puzzle pieces that piled up. Point one, the discovery of unknown ancient writings in different languages and their initial translation showed some close interrelations among them, and these interrelations suggested some sort of language diaspora. Point two, geology had already shown that big floods do happen. For example, 5 million years ago, before any humans were around, the Mediterranean basin had been empty for some time. And then the Gibraltar land barrier broke, unleashing a flood that would make Noah's great flood seem wimpy. Today, point three, today, the salty Black Sea in its over 6,000 foot deep basin is level with the Mediterranean Sea. From before 8,000 BCE, however, and for at least a couple thousand years, the basin contained a slowly drying out and shrinking freshwater lake. By about 6,000 BCE, this lake had a level some 550 feet lower than today's Mediterranean Sea. Because at this time, the Bosporus was not open to the basin. Point four, sonar data show the now submerged ancient Stone Age deltas of some of the rivers that flow into the Black Sea basin. Back then, they flowed into the lower, smaller freshwater lake. Indeed, the sonar data indicate the lowest shoreline of this ancient shrunken lake to be about 550 feet below the level of today's Black Sea, revealing hundreds of miles a gently sloping land surface that now remain underwater. Point 5, fossils in the core samples from under the Black Sea show the transition from freshwater to salty water happened quickly on human timescales. Some cores also showed the presence of dry mudflats just under those fossils. Some cores also showed the presence of sand dunes that had not been altered by any gradual rise in the level of the nearby lake, but had instead quickly been inundated. Point 6, dating the core parts from the time just before the saltwater invasion gives an age of some 7,600 years ago, or about 5,600 BCE. Around this time, the pressure of water, which had been building in the Mediterranean Sea as its level rose hundreds of feet due to end of ice age melting, broke through the Bosporus land dam and began dumping Mediterranean Sea salt water into the then somewhat empty Black Sea basin and its freshwater lake. Point 7, by the time of this saltwater invasion, farming had already been practiced in neighboring Anatolia and Greece for over 1,000 years. Sadly, present science budgets cannot afford searches under the current waters of the Black Sea Basin for archaeological evidence of farming. Point 8, still the presence of farming around the freshwater lake's shoreline makes an appropriate presumption. The farming communities around the ancient lake would have substantive investments in their homeland. Expulsion by a permanent flood would have seemed like annihilation. Point 9, from the input of the rivers that empty into the basin, if the waters of the lake had risen gradually at the rate that the oceans rose once glacial ice caps started melting, the fastest rate would never exceed 6 feet a century, which is about 1/500th of an inch per day. You can check my math. The dating, however, of the evidence from numerous core samples and from the discovered size and height of the later Bosporus opening show that the lake level rose at a much faster rate. It rose at the rate of 6 inches per day. Given the shallow slope of the basin's sides, a 6-inch rise in water level per day would each day cover another mile of dry land with water. Point 10, the usual response of hunters and gatherers to floods is simply to move on. Such floods and movements were common enough and no big deal in the hunter-gatherer experience. An exodus, however, would have had the power to build myth, as farmers and herders would have had to take their seed and animals with them for survival. Point 11, the sonar data showed that on the wide shelf of the ancient lake west of the Crimea, the dry land around the lake angled up at no more than 2 feet per mile. Someone escaping the onslaught of the rising tide on this shelf would have had to travel on average 1/4 mile per day to keep up with the inundation. Point 12, if fleeing up the very flat river valleys, they would have had to move 1/2 mile to 1 mile per day, every day, day after day, for more than the usual 40 days, more likely for 100 to 200 days, to cover enough ground to stay out of the rising water. And all these days, they would have needed to worry about and carry everything that they could carry. Now, certainly, this was a unique and scary months-long trek that would not soon be forgotten. And so began the multi-direction migration of peoples and cultures away from the rising sea and into the facts and legends of history. Indeed, the oral traditions of many cultures in this widening geographic area retold this story with many different culture-derived and culture-supporting embellishments like king lists and religious morals and biases. These established stories come down to us today from when the oral traditions were finally written in stone, literally on clay tablets, and later on papyrus and vellum and paper, as the stories of the likes of Gilgamesh and Noah. After assembling the data that answered questions about a location, the Black Sea, a date, 5,600 BCE, the magnitude of the flood, 6 inches per day, the time available to escape, rising waters for a year or two, the distance to be covered in escaping, hundreds of miles, many questions remain. Who might have witnessed the flood and formed the subsequent migration away from the rising waters? What languages did they speak? Where did they go and settle? Numerous strands of evidence document that around this time, in the wake of the Black Sea flood, several peoples appeared as if out of nowhere in the archaeological record to the west and northwest of the Black Sea Basin, as well as to the northeast and southeast. These were farming peoples settling on unoccupied land or previously occupied land, as well as land occupied by hunters and gatherers whom they displaced. All but one of these groups strictly avoided living near any ocean coastlines, as if they had been chased upstream by a flood and still worried that the fountains of the deep would spring forth again. The areas where the new peoples from the flood diaspora appeared quickly included not only parts of Europe and southern Russia, but also Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, indeed the whole Fertile Crescent. So the cradle from which Western civilization actually sprang seems really to have been the flooded rim of the Black Sea Basin's old freshwater lake. The data even strongly suggests that the flood-caused diaspora began not only the foundational branching of the daughter languages of Proto-Indo-European, but also a similarly timed branching of the human genetic tree. This real and horrifying flood experience thus remained alive in its continual and increasingly multilingual retelling across numerous cultures, from Europe to India, from Russia to Africa, and into today's world. In our own time, beyond the well-researched preservative techniques of epic storytelling, natural science has added analyses of the preservative documentation in the kinds of text recorded in the layers of mud, sand, and gravel from the bottom of lakes and seas using the tools and principles of physics, chemistry, biology. The scientific plot can then be given richer details and new themes from the supporting contributions of the archaeologist, the linguist, the geneticist. The discoveries that produced all these points were originally unrelated, remember, occurring a piece here, a bit there. Any connections initially went unrecognized. Little by little, however, the researchers began to connect the dots. Patterns and sequences of facts and dates began to stand out. The big picture began to emerge. So far, though, like those discoveries, my presentation of these points necessarily comes out disjointed. Now, though, perhaps we can put them together and paint that big picture of a new great flood story, a science flood story for today's world. Today, the top 50 feet of the Bosphorus flows south out of the Black Sea. Meanwhile, the rest of the Bosphorus waters, the salty bottom current below 50 feet, flows north into the Black Sea, a kind of last vestige of the Great Flood that happened in 5,600 BCE or 7,625 years ago. Below the bottom current, the channel of the Bosphorus, cut by the flood's inflow, bottoms out at 400 feet deep, about 100 feet above the level of the shrunken Ice Age Black Sea lake. Initially, the floodwaters through the gap may have started just as a trickle, a small stream. Within days, however, it would have washed through the loose soils and gravels, gaining power first as a brook and then as an ever-growing river, swiftly and forcibly scouring and gouging out its bottom and sides deeper and wider. Within days, it became a turbulent river with the torrent of a maelstrom. Within days, it became a thundering flume, twisting and churning with rubble and debris, cutting deeper and spreading faster as it poured out 10 cubic miles of water every day. Enough every day to cover Manhattan Island to a depth of over half a mile. For around 2 years, mostly after the human populations had fled, the waters continued to climb up the shallow sides of the Black Sea basin, perhaps with less violence in the second year. The floodwaters finally filled the basin to the present Black Sea level, the level of the Bosphorus and the Mediterranean, over 500 feet above the level of the ancient Ice Age lake. When the swollen Mediterranean waters had finally broken through the Bosphorus land dam and flowed in, the flood had the volume of 200 Niagaras and quickly began raising the lake level by those 6 inches per day, covering another mile-wide swath of previously dry land all around the rising shoreline. The Bosphorus flume roared and surged at full spate for at least 300 days. The waters roared through the narrow Bosphorus Strait at speeds greater than 50 miles per hour, crashing through unabated, radiating a thunderous din and vibration that could possibly be heard and felt around the entire rim of the Black Sea, a shoreline that had hosted and supported numerous communities, people that must now get out of the way. The beginning of that din was the last of various warning signs, but one still had time to flee. And would the low-pitched rumbling terror sound like the warning voice of a powerful deity supposedly ticked off by some human iniquities, telling of a permanent flood and that it was time to move away? And move away people did, moving daily to higher and higher ground, mile after terrible, tortured mile, all to escape from what? Such incredible, continuous violence may only have been understandable to people at that time as nothing short of the collective fury of all their gods, whom they must have somehow displeased. With all this water and flooding, who needs fire and brimstone? All those experiences got indelibly planted in the survivors' oral and later written history. And for those whose migration led them to Mesopotamia, where some of the great flood stories continued, their oral traditions were regularly dramatized and reinforced by the usual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, reminding them of the big one from which they got away. And that was how they told their story to all their descendant generations and cultures, each with its particular slant and variation of the flood escape theme, retold in and beyond the original diaspora, retold for us as the Noah story, retold until today with a new story version emerging from the human activity known as science, with new and appropriate lessons for human behavior and how we treat each other and our world and everything in it. So now we have a different kind of story about the same ancient flood. Beyond the incontestable emotional reactions that we have to such horrendous legendary events, both then and now, today we have some incontestable scientific facts about the actual historical events behind the many flood stories, and with as many lessons to help us move through today's world and on into tomorrow's world. That ancient flood forced a diaspora of people and cultures. Their movements and the stories they left us have over the past 7 millennia indeed changed the course of human history. And today's scientific story about the flood can and must similarly change the course of today's history on into the future. Please let that inspire you.